The chapter on labor markets in the OECD report was prepared jointly by Alessandro and myself, and we're also going to split the presentation. And the way we'll split it is that I'll first talk about the nature of dualism in the Korean labor market. I'll focus primarily on comparisons with other advanced economies in the OECD. I think that's where the OECD can add the most. There's already lots of good research in Korea about labor market patterns here. And then Alessandro will speak about the policy response to break down the dualism that's so entrenched currently in the labor market. And one of the, I think, slight innovations, or at least the emphasis in our policy discussion, is that it's really important not only to have policies to break down the overall dualism in the labor market, but to focus on specific barriers that women, older workers, and youth are facing to fully realize their potential in the labor market. So some targeted measures as well as general measures to attack dualism. Moving on to making some presentation or some comparisons of dualism in Korea and other countries. First, I should start with an important caveat. Dualism in every country is unique, so there's some level of incomparability you can't escape. I'll be using internationally harmonized definitions to make the comparisons as meaningful as possible, but you always lose some of the particularities of Korea and the other countries I'd be comparing Korea against. The one aspect of dualism where you can make the comparison most meaningfully in a quantitative sense is temporary employment forms, because those are almost everywhere where labor market dualism is important. Much of it takes the form of temporary jobs. In Korea, about 1/4 of all jobs are temporary by the international definition, which means the worker in question either has a fixed-term contract, they were dispatched to the firm they're working at by a temporary work agency, or they have what's I think we've called here in Korea in English, they're on-call or daily workers. And that encompasses about 3/4 of the official definition of non-regular workers in Korea, but certain types of non-regular jobs like part-time are left out unless they also happen to be on fixed-term contracts, say. Anyway, the first message here, and it's one that I'll repeat several times, is that the number of non-regular workers is relatively high in Korea. In terms of temporary workers, about 1/4. In terms of non-regular workers overall, about 1/3 in recent years. That's considerably above the average in the OECD, although as you can see, other OECD countries, there's quite a wide range. Few countries have higher incidence, but they're all relatively low income, less developed as compared to the range of countries you see in the OECD. One of the reasons this matters is that workers in non-regular jobs tend to be paid a lot less lower wage than regular workers. And one of the ways that shows up, and I think you already saw this chart this morning, is that earnings inequality and low wage employment is quite high incidence in Korea. In fact, it's in both cases about the highest that we observe in Korea. The bar here is share of workers earning, full-time workers earning less than 2/3 of the median wage. And then the dot is the 90-10 dispersion ratio. In both cases, it's particularly high in Korea. Also, I think we already saw this morning, it's important to realize that talking about labor market dualism, in some countries, it's largely a case of employment contract type. In Korea, it's also very much a sectoral issue, that it has related strongly to the relative underdevelopment of the services sector and small firms, many of which are in the services sector. What this chart shows is that Korea really stands out that whereas wages in the service sector were close to comparable with those in the manufacturing in 1990, they've fallen now to be, they're just over half the wage in manufacturing. So there's been a real gap in terms of service sector not developing in parallel with the manufacturing sector, and that's one of the reasons why there's a number of workers, Korean workers, have troubles accessing good jobs. Another factor that, this is probably the data exercise in this report that surprised me the most. We used internationally harmonized statistics on employment by tenure to create an estimate of the share of workers changing jobs every year, the worker turnover rate. And the OECD, or sorry, the Korea comes out as having far and away the highest rate which in the data sense, it means there's a higher fraction of Korean workers have less than a year of tenure when you look at them in the survey of the economically active population. That translates into a higher estimated turnover rate. Part of this is a problem that's often associated with, commonly associated with non-regular work, which is that type of work tends to be more insecure. It should be pointed out, though, that part of the very high worker turnover rate in Korea is actually a good thing. It is that people who are looking for a job, out of work, tend to find a job and move into a new job very quickly. Because the worker turnover rate is not just separations, people leaving jobs, it's also people moving into new jobs. And the sum of the two is particularly high in Korea because both separations and hires are high. Finally, we also use the CLIPS panel data set to look at to what extent are non-regular jobs in Korea stepping stones to regular jobs, in which case it's less worrisome than if they're traps where workers spend most of their careers. The first comparison I'm showing here is for temporary employment. As I mentioned before, that's the part of non-regular work that's most comparable across countries. There, this is the 1 year chance a temporary worker moves into a permanent job. And you can see that the mobility rate there that we calculated from the CLIPS is substantially lower than the rate that we've calculated for other countries using other data sets. So that suggests that there's a considerable danger that people in non-regular or temporary jobs in Korea have a particularly difficult time moving into more stable jobs. We also, in the case of Japan and Korea, made comparisons for non-regular workers generally, and where the generally is understood in terms of the definitions used in those two countries. In Japan, what that means is largely what it means is adding part-time workers to temporary workers. In Korea, it's a number of different categories of atypical workers and so on get added in. One of the things we found here is that whereas for just temporary workers, mobility was lower in Korea than for Japan, when you move to non-regular workers, that relationship switches. The reason for that is that when you add part-time workers in Japan, those are mostly women, and most of those jobs are pretty stable. That women in part-time work don't move into full-time work very often, but they also, their jobs are pretty stable. In Korea, I guess we'd have to say we really don't know what the overall mobility situation is. There's a number of different ways in the CLIPS data set to identify non-regular workers, none of them totally satisfactory. The official definition here on the left, the Ministry of Employment and Labor advised us how, with CLIPS variables, to come as close as possible to the official tripartite definition. That shows quite high mobility. If instead you use the self-assessment by workers where they have a regular or non-regular job, you get a lot less flexibility. So I think there we just don't really know quite what the situation is. Just to sum up on my part of the presentation, I think the international comparisons confirm that the consensus in Korea, dualism is quite strong and well entrenched in Korea. A third of the population or so in non-regular jobs. But it's also related to the underdevelopment of small firms and the service sector. The dualism reflects some functional needs of employers. They do need to be cost competitive and be flexible. But as Alessandra's going to talk about, the experience in other countries suggests there's other ways to achieve cost competitiveness and flexibility without creating so much inequality and insecurity. Also, I didn't show it in charts, but women and older workers are particularly affected by non-regular employment. Youth, I think, are also affected by labor market dualism, but in a more subtle way that it affects how the skills mismatch problem plays out with many youth now having university degrees, but employers not looking to hire that many people with advanced education. And then finally, because women and older workers in particular are disadvantaged by dualism, the cost of labor market dualism, both in equity but even more in an economic growth sense, is going to increase as the population ages. Because if the only way to, as the labor force shrinks and ages, to keep the labor force, keep economic growth strong, is to make better use of women and older workers in the labor force. And current patterns, most women after they are married and have children, and most workers after taking fairly early retirement from the career job, are not in high productive jobs anymore. And that's a pattern that's going to be increasingly problematic in the future. So I'll turn it over now to Alessandro to talk about the solution to dualism.